Captain Greenskin. When Hearthstone was first released, this card was useful for precisely one thing: completing your pirate collection to get 2 free copies of a parrot. Since then, that special quest was removed from the game, and the card seemed to fade into obscurity, becoming as useless and niche a legendary as the likes of Gruul and Onyxia. Okay, maybe I'm being a little harsh, the card still saw play in off-meta pirate decks, but otherwise it didn't really work. But when Rise of Shadows came out, an interesting thing happened. Like all metas before it, certain decks became top tier, the most notable ones being Tempo Rogue and Bomb Warrior. And what card is used in both of these decks? You guessed it, Captain Greenskin. The reason this has come about is multifaceted, as are most things in this game. So let's break it down. Today we'll answer 2 questions. The first, why hasn't Greenskin seen serious play before? And second, why is he seeing play now? Well, let's get to it, and examine the legend of Captain Greenskin. Let's start with a breakdown of the card. Greenskin is obviously understated, which means that his battlecry must be activated for the card to truly be valuable. In regards to that, the concept of buffing a weapon is an interesting one, but the short version is that the player gets 1 extra swing with the weapon if they survive that long. If the weapon is buffed but its user dies the next turn, that resource is unspent, and therefore useless. So to maximize this card's power, it must be played with a weapon that has as much attack as possible. Since Greenskin gives an extra swing, the more attack the better, while the durability of the weapon is quite irrelevant. In fact, thanks to how Blizzard balances Hearthstone cards, the ideal durability is as low as possible so that the weapon has more attack. This boils down to the battlecry having 2 requirements: have a high attack weapon, and have 1 additional turn to use it. However, this effect alone is valued as a 1 mana card, which means that for Greenskin to see play, its 5 mana 5/4 body needs to be used. Since those stats are offensively leaning, this card needs to be played in a deck utilizing Tempo, which fortunately aligns with our weapon plan. As a final requirement, the player needs to be winning when Greenskin is played. There's no precise reason for this conclusion, but if the player doesn't have board control, the body is going to get killed more easily, and the weapon is less likely to be used for its full value. So to mitigate the odds of this worst case scenario, the card should only be played when ahead on board. Altogether, a seemingly reasonable list. Use high attack weapons, be a tempo focused deck, and be winning. Plenty of Hearthstone decks over the game's history have fulfilled the first 3 of these requirements. The problem is the last one. The odds of a player winning in the early game are about 50%, slightly more if you're playing an aggressive deck. Having Greenskin in hand when that condition hasn't been fulfilled makes him somewhat useless. This means that Greenskin fits best into aggro decks, which have a greater than 50% chance to win the early game and then push from there. In the early days of Hearthstone, this was a problem for the card for one simple reason: it was too slow. Aggro decks up until the Year of the Kraken would often try ending the game by turn 5, meaning that this slower paced choice wasn't quite adequate. Even during the Years of the Kraken and Mammoth, when aggressive pirate weapon decks were top tier, Greenskin was nowhere to be seen. That plus a smaller card pool, which meant that there were less high attack weapons to choose from, meant that our poor captain was unusable. Too slow, too inconsistent, too inadequate. It was almost alright, but only sometimes. It's worth noting that in this time period, Blizzard was rightly paranoid about weapons with high attack. These cards only had a handful of counters and were used almost exclusively in aggressive decks. Even with the release of Kobolds and Catacombs, where 9 legendary weapons were the centerpiece of the expansion, there were no weapons with 5 attack or more. Though don't get me wrong, Kingsbane was able to become stronger, which is why it was the first deck where Greenskin actually saw play. But even then, he was often bypassed for different choices. With Kingsbane being both nerfed and rotated out once Rise of Shadows hit, it looked like Greenskin's brief time in the limelight was about to end. But it didn't. This card instead soared in relevance. Why did this happen? Well, a lot of things were holding Greenskin back before: aggro being too fast, the card not having enough synergies, and it just generally being too hard to use. With the new expansion, all of this was suddenly reversed, the card's weaknesses averted and the strengths capitalized on. First and foremost, aggro became slower. While the road was arduous and littered with missteps, Blizzard was able to slow the pace of aggro down, avoiding the days of Face Hunter and Pirate Warrior. This naturally had many benefits, but in this case, our slower aggressive legendary became at least mildly more appealing. A good start, but not enough by itself. Second, Greenskin now had synergies in the form of high attack weapons. While we may never see a weapon at 5 attack or more ever again, Blizzard has finally seemed to come to terms with how to balance these cards. Rise of Shadows gave us Wrench Caliber and the Wagglepeck, both weapons that are an absolute delight to anyone holding a Greenskin in hand. An on-curve 2 durability weapon that is quite powerful with each swing? Sign him up! But the thing is, even in this perfect storm, Greenskin doesn't shine perfectly. Greenskin's final limit is that he's hard to use. Even with the benefits laid out above, the card still needs its user to have a weapon. In Bomb Warrior, despite having Wrench Caliper and the means to win the early game, the card is still the weakest link, and I wouldn't recommend crafting him if you plan on making that deck. But Blizzard implemented one final ace in the hole that allowed this legendary to finally shine. Ladies and gentlemen, the true reason that this card is as powerful as it is, its perfect synergy with Raiding Party. This particular spell is one of the strongest cards in the game right now. It's the third strongest card in Tempo Rogue, and it doesn't provide any tempo. The story of why this card is so strong is one for another time. For our purposes, the way this card assists Greenskin should be incredibly obvious. If played on curve using a Preparation or the Coin, the card draw sets up for a perfect weapon to be played on turn 4 and a perfect pirate to be played in conjunction on turn 5. Even if that precise circumstance isn't met, this card still ensures a weapon is drawn, and increases the odds that our captain comes with it. All these reasons that Captain Greenskin has gone from unusable to super strong make the legendary a fascinating case study. When it was first printed, the card was perfectly balanced, but required synergies with a rare archetype and needed to be placed in a fast deck but not too fast of a deck. It took everything Blizzard had to change the game to enable this card, through the use of direct and indirect support. This goes to show Hearthstone's complexity. While an individual card might seem weak, the right synergies can enable it to be used quite effectively. Well played, Blizzard. Now try to pull the same trick with Illidan or Gruul. I'll be very impressed if you manage to make them work.